Hello, Garland Nixon here, hanging out with Peter Erickson, who is live from Sochi, Russia. Yes, he's in the part of Russia where there's warm weather and beautiful beaches and palm trees and all that kind of stuff. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we've got, oh, wait a minute, Sochi. Trying to look for a map of Sochi. There we go. Is that on the Black Sea?
It sure is.
Yes, sirree. Right there we go. Right across from Turkey. So you're in Sochi, huh? How's it look there? What's the town look like? What's the atmosphere that going on in Sochi?
Well, it's a resort city, and very different from the Russian cities I've been in before. You know, all the other cities I've been in, mostly Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan, Nizhny Novgorod. They're all up in the north. It's flat. It's cool in the summer, long days. And I come down here and yeah, there are palm trees here. It's not, when you think of Russia, you don't think of palm trees and sunburn and people walking around in shorts and bikinis and whatever, but that's the way it is here. It's like the other Russian cities I've been in. It's very clean, safe, you know, I've heard some idiots describing Russia as a third world country. It doesn't have that feel at all. You know, it's very, very prosperous, very, you know, very modern city.
Yeah,
and a great place.
They should go to LA and Frisco. There was, you know, shanty towns and, you know, garbage heaps and homeless camps everywhere. At any rate, let's keep going. I think this is important. Your thoughts on what you're hearing, say, in the Russian media, from Russian people, from the people you know, the optimism, pessimism, whatever the case may be. Are you even getting any kind of thing like that? You know, while you're there?
Well, not really. You know, I only know a few words of Russian.
Okay.
Our daughter is our guide. She knows Russian, but you know, we haven't. I get that kind of information through her and through her friends. Mm-hmm. And I say just in general, you know, from what I hear through her is that people here are quite optimistic. And the years that she's been here, actually, you have to go back like 15 years, the first time that she visited Russia, and she fell in love in Russia at that time. She has seen a noticeable improvement. And if you go all the way back to 2000 or 1999, when Putin took over, it's been, you know, a huge improvement. In fact, the taxi driver you know, who took us from the airport to the hotel, he was talking about, he says, man, you know, in the 1990s, this was a rough place. You know, the criminal gangs, they basically ran the place. And, but then Putin came in power and he cleaned it up. And he said, and look, you know, it's clean, it's safe, it's a wonderful city now. People notice that, you know, it's, so in general, it just seems like people are optimistic. You would hardly know that there's a war going on. Now, occasionally there are incidents, like even in Sochi, I think about a week ago, there were some drones that were spotted flying towards Sochi. And like at the beaches where I spent the day yesterday, they broadcast an alert and everybody had to go running. In the end, I think, you know, like somebody was injured. You know, Sochi's a pretty good sized city. So, you know, one person was injured. It's bad for obviously that person, but it's in the life of the city, most people are just not affected. So there are these incidents, and you know, with the drones in particular, and sometimes airports get shut down. But other than that, you just wouldn't even know. And again, these incidents are few and far between. You know, most weeks of the year, nothing happens. And the only thing I've noticed that there are just a few kind of, not exactly billboards, but like, you know, the signs on bus stops or whatever, where like a hero, a soldier that distinguished himself in the SMO, you know, he's up there. Or I saw one today that said, "Victory will be ours." But it's it's not over. Here and there you'll see little things like that. So it's there, it's in the background. People know what's going on, but all in all, you just have this sense of normalcy. It's just like, people are living their lives, and life is getting better. That's what the economic statistics, even during the SMO, life is getting better. Wages are rising, real wages are rising, and unemployment is very, very low. There was some inflation, but that's died down. I've noticed that. That's one thing. Like I was here a year ago, and even better 2 years ago. Back then, the exchange rate was a lot better for Americans. So the combination of like the weakening dollar and the inflation has made this Russia more expensive. It's still cheaper than the US for an American, but it's not so cheap as it was a couple of years ago. So that's a downside for a tourist like myself.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that the standard of living of Russia has so dramatically increased over the last 20-25 years. At any rate, let's get going. It's interesting that the takes that we're getting, right, the various takes that we're getting on the Alaska summit. One take is this is an off ramp. And we even hear words like final off ramp. Putin's offering Trump the final off ramp. Blah blah blah. Okay. Another one we hear is it's a trap. They're going to bring Putin there and they're going to do him in, or, some kind of a geopolitical strategic trap. They're going to bring him there and then they're going to say, okay, let's get a deal. And when they, the usual, when they don't get a deal, they'll say, that's it, bone crushing sanctions and tariffs and all of that stuff. And the other is it's absolute geopolitical brilliance by either Trump or Putin. No, few people say both, but yes, this is brilliant for Trump, or it's brilliant for Putin because he's going to get this, that, or this. And I think this is my nature. I think it's just it's a lot more nuanced than to be put in one of those categories. Yeah. Let me throw that at you.
Yeah, there's a heck of a lot of speculation about this because I don't know. First of all, when you're dealing with Trump, you just don't know. The guy's unpredictable. He often reverses himself. What's going on in Trump's mind? That's the $64,000 question, and I don't think anybody knows the answer. Trump probably doesn't know the answer. So, that's part of it. I think, I wonder why Putin agreed to this, because in the past he was saying, we can meet with Trump. I can meet with Trump, but we first need to lay the groundwork. We got to make some kind of progress where we can, really have some sort of substantive discussion where we can, the chance of really reaching some kind of settlement is possible. Clearly, we're not there yet. The groundwork has not been laid. So why did Putin agree to this? I'm not sure, but maybe it was something that he heard from Steve Witkoff, and we don't know what it is. We can say, it's stupid for Putin to do this, or it's brilliant, or whatever, but we don't really know what he heard, what information he got from that maybe caused him to change his mind. I don't know. It seems like, maybe not terribly risky on Putin's part. The worst thing that can happen is that Trump will throw some kind of tantrum, and then we'll be back to where we were before. He was throwing a tantrum about a month ago and, complaining about Putin, and threatening the sanctions and all that. Well, he can go back to, even now, I guess, like when he's asked, will you impose sanctions if you don't get a ceasefire? Say, yeah. But we've shown that that's just a bluff. He can't, that's not a card that he has. The sanctions or tariffs really, they're not a real option. So, what is Putin scared of there? Trump's angry at him. Trump threatens tariffs again. Well, we've been there. We've been through that. And okay, nothing really lost. I guess there is a chance that, I don't know, but again, we don't know what Witkoff said, that they could agree to something, that there's something could come out of this, and I don't even pretend to know what it is. It may be directly related to the war. It might be something even, something else. There are other things where they can work on bilateral relations, but perhaps they can walk away with something. And well, especially if it is related to the war, then Trump can say, okay, look, we've made this deal. We've taken this important step forward. Maybe there's this rumor about, asking the Ukrainians to withdraw from the Donbass is true. And they agreed to that. And then and Russia would agree temporarily to set aside their claims to Zaporozhye and Kherson. I don't know if they would do this, or it would be wise for them to do that. But maybe they can make, at least temporarily, we'll say this is apparent, at least apparently some kind of compromise. And then, okay, Putin could do something, agree to something like that, make an apparent concession, knowing that the other side, namely the Ukrainians, will reject it. The Ukrainians reject it. He says both Trump and Putin can say, hey, we tried. And then maybe that's the off-ramp that we hope for, where the Americans say, well, hey, we did our best. They wouldn't agree to it. Now it's Ukraine, it's your problem, you and the Europeans. We're getting out of here, and could walk away. That's, I think, the very best we could hope for. It's not impossible. I just, whenever I think about Trump and the chaos in his own administration, the chaos in his own head, I kind of wonder if he can really pull anything off. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, well, there's two things to me. More so than Trump, whoever was in that position, right? Just put a blank person there, and the infamous NPC, right? Yeah. The question is, what could they do based on the powers that be that say this can't be done or that can be done, right? So that's, how much agency does Trump actually have when it comes to this is always the question that none of us know. And most of us who are quite cynical, err on the side of very little, But I would say this. I think from the Russians, I don't believe for 1 second that, and this is what I always say, people are like, I think Putin will be fooled, he'll be had, and I think one thing I'm not going to do is assume that I'm smarter than Putin and Lavrov. Those guys have played their hands very well based on what I've seen the last, even 10 years. I got to say they're brilliant geopolitical strategists. And I got to assume they're a hell of a lot smarter than I am. That's my first assumption. So I'm not going to be like, oh, they're being fooled. Why, I can figure this out. But Putin and Lavrov couldn't. Yeah, no, I'm not that naive, right? So I'm going to give them credit and say, hey, they're probably pretty smart guys. So that being said, I'm going to say a couple of things. I think no matter what, and this has been one of my positions, one of the positions of Russia is the U.S. and Russia should have bilateral talks and should maintain an open chain of discussion constantly, that it is critical for these two nuclear powered countries to maintain an open dialogue, no matter what. No matter how much we hate each other, history says this is what we need to do. No matter what happens, the Russians, if they get that dialogue, if they just sit there and play tiddlywinks for 2 hours and they all leave, and they say, we'll meet again and play tiddlywinks and maybe we'll discuss the upcoming nuclear treaties, whatever. From the perspective of the Russia and the world, I think it's beneficial. We'll start there.
Yeah, well,
go ahead. Any comment on that?
Yeah, well, I would say, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is good to just maintain relations, talk. This is something that was lost entirely under Biden, and this is a step in the right direction. I agree. I guess again, it's just like the incompetence of the Trump administration. I think should cause us to be. Should prevent us from being really too optimistic, though. This will lead to anything very significant. Even the most basic things, like originally they were talking about restaffing the embassies, right? They did have a couple of meetings, I think, in Istanbul, and after following that meeting in Riyadh, but it just didn't go anywhere. And this is the simplest thing. We could restaff the embassies, but they haven't even done that. So, But anyway, but still talking, just having, even if it's just on the level of a personal relationship, I think it actually is helpful and can keep us out of deeper trouble. Because one thing that we haven't seen actually since Trump has been in office, and I think we have to give credit to Trump for this, we haven't seen those ATACMS missile strikes into pre-2014 territory. That was really scary, and that took us
yes,
to the edge of World War III. Right. And there is going to be pressure again to get him to maybe start those up and maybe even go farther with the JASSM and extended range or even worse, the Tomahawks. There are crazies that are going to try to push Trump into doing that. But maybe just by the fact of having this personal relationship with Putin and learning to trust him on some level, and Putin says, hey, like all this stuff, okay, we disagree, but this, understand, Mr. Trump, this is really serious. And if you do this, we're going to have to, this could lead us to World War III. And just by keeping that channel open, where Trump can actually hear that instead of having everything filtered, I think that could actually save us. Again, I'm not such a fool to believe that they're actually going to negotiate a settlement to this war. It's going to be, but maybe if we could at least not have World War III, that's something to be grateful for.
Exactly. We can prevent a nuclear exchange we'll have to start there. You got to crawl before you can walk, as they say. And if crawling means that we don't all die, okay, let's crawl. I also think that, and again, I'm cynical and I accept reality. The United States is at war with the world. It's at war with modernity. In the modern world, other world powers are rising. And the United States is not the hegemonic presence that it views itself. And it's at war with that. Oh, India, BRICS, Iran, everybody, we got to stop you. And the U.S. is exhausting itself economically and militarily in trying to fight a changing world and stop the world from changing. Doggone it, universe, you better stop changing. And we don't want that. And so we're going to stop it. We will be the internal empire. Well, the U.S. is exhausting itself doing that. And the idea that they're suddenly going to be the nice guys and decide to be friends with Russia and not try to take them out, as in fact, they're trying to, build a back door in Azerbaijan. We'd be naive to believe that. And I don't believe the Russians are naive. But I think the other part of it, I think, is this. I think that my thoughts, why did the Russians say we'll talk? I think this. The narrative has been about the U.S. and the West. Yes, it's all about conquest. They want to take more land. The Russians, it has nothing to do with conquest. We want to talk about NATO expansion up to our border and the threat that creates. It gives the Russians an opportunity to sit in front of Donald Trump and his people and say, listen, our concerns are about NATO expansion. We need to talk about NATO expansion. We need to talk about our security. We can talk about who gets Zaporozhye and Kherson and all these other oblasts that half the time people can't pronounce, let alone spell them, because they're spelled and pronounced one way in Ukrainian and another way in Russian. Fair enough, we can get that done. But the only way we're going to fix this is if we talk about what we need to talk about. Hey, remember this document we gave you in December of 2021? Here it is again. We want to talk. I think that's one of the things they'll do. We gave this document to the Biden administration and said, we need to talk about these things. And then the Biden administration said, no, we'd like to personally hand you this document again about NATO expansion and our border. This is what we need to talk about. I suspect that in the midst of let's face it, a military debacle on the battlefield, which drove a lot of this, that Witkoff and crew said to the Russians, we want to talk. Okay, we'll talk about the NATO expansion and this other stuff. And at that point, the Russians say, okay, we'll talk. They may not even intend to talk about it. They may be just, we got to get them in there to try to get out. This battlefield's falling apart. Right. But I think they somehow said, we'll talk about what you want to talk about. And the Russian says, well, then, because the Russian says, no, we're not doing a Putin meeting. They had to say something. And I think what they said is, we're willing to listen to what you want to talk about. What do you think about that? And again, speculation.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a well-founded speculation. That may have been what Witkoff, offered to them. Say that maybe that was the change in attitude that they noticed. I say a willingness to talk about this, or before it wasn't there. So they see, okay, maybe they even talked among themselves and said, this probably won't go anywhere. But hey, if there's a chance, if we see the door opening a crack here, maybe we should push on it and see what happens. And I don't think it'll go anywhere, but you have to try. I mean, in the end, I mean, it's not just for you. Well, it's really, in the interest of everybody to end this war on acceptable terms, again, which the Russians have laid out. The Russians can win, without this. They can win without a settlement. They will win without a settlement. I think, there's really no doubt about that. But it would still be to their benefit, and to their benefit, and certainly to the benefit of the Ukrainians, if they can address these larger issues. Because if they fail to address these larger issues, even if they do, in the end, occupy all this territory, maybe the 4 oblasts, but probably even beyond. They get it all. But if the issues aren't addressed, the causes, the underlying threat, it's not gone. And there's always a chance that the war could flare up again. You still have this hostile power in Western Ukraine. You're still supported by the Europeans, who still have, who still see Russia as an existential threat, and are going to continue to, do whatever they can, to bleed Russia, whether it's through asymmetric attacks or the continuation of the sanctions. Obviously that hasn't done much, but it's if nothing else, it's an irritant for the Russians. All of that is going to continue, even with a Russian victory, if they don't have a settlement. So sure, they're going to always look for the opportunity for a settlement. It's something that they, truly believe in. Maybe rather naively. I think that maybe that they have almost too much faith in Western rationality at this point. I think they have. I think they have this naive faith that if we continue to show them, what the reality is, at some point they'll come around to it, acknowledge it, and then we can reach an agreement with them. I think that it's really not possible, but I can't fault the Russians for trying. I guess I should just put it that way.
I don't think the Russians are naive. I think they very well understand what they're up against. But I think there's another factor here that I always throw out. I think the Russians are pretty rare. I think the Kremlin's like, yeah, we know. They've said it time and again. Lavrov said several years ago, the West is, what did he call it? Agreement incapable.
Yeah.
Right. He said, you can't make agreement with these people. They're not getting us again. They lied. And Putin even came out and said, when he talked about Minsk, he said, in a nutshell, if I sum it up, I was lied to. It was my fault. I was naive for believing them. Right. So with the statements they've made, they've let it out there. We know who these people are. I think there's another factor. The Russians place a high degree of importance on diplomacy. Right. High degree, because look, they don't have the money of or the population of the US or China, but they're considered by many an equal world power for a number of reasons. OK, but one of their real true strength is diplomacy. Looking at they get along with everybody. The Africans love them. The Middle Easterns love them. The Asians are loving them more and more every day. I think they believe that it is important that when they're dealing with BRICS, India, whatever, Africa, when they're dealing with their allies, that they can always say, we do everything we can to work on peace. We've done everything we can, even though they know, these people ain't going to, you can't trust them as far as you can throw a tank. You know what I mean? But I think that a lot of this is, I'm not going to use the word performative, because if the U.S. struck a deal, the Russians would take what I like to call a money in hand deal. Where somebody says, "Let's make a deal," and the guy, my dad would say this: "I think I'll be needing the money up front." In other words, I ain't trusting you later, pal. Anything that I get, I'm getting now. That was his term for a money in hand deal, right? So I think if any deal they get, it would be, we got to get what we're going to get now because we don't trust it for the future. But I think with the Russians, it's critical that they can say to the Chinese, the Indians, the Africans, blah, 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 that they can say, we're doing everything we can to work with these people. So I think it's more about their diplomatic alliances, partnerships, than it is about actually trusting us. What do you think?
I don't disagree. When that makes perfect sense. It's I think it actually explains a lot of Russian behavior over the last several years, even that Putin has always taken into account his relationships with other countries, especially with these other great powers like India and China, Brazil, and so forth. And I think there's no question that there's been maybe not exactly friction, but he has heard, especially in the early months in the first year of the SMO, a certain amount of criticism. Certainly criticism that was voiced, not, in very harsh terms. And that's something that he responds to. These relationships are important to him. And you're right. He wants to demonstrate a willingness to show that, yeah, he is looking for a diplomatic solution. I think, in fact, if you look closely to the Russians' actions, both before and immediately after the launch of the SMO, it's clear that they were actually putting diplomacy first, and that explains, why the SMO was actually conducted on such a small scale to begin with, because they were looking from the very beginning for a diplomatic solution. But they also needed to convince their partners of that. I don't think that they understood that fully, but you get the sense I'm not hearing the same kind of criticisms of the Russian position, from, let's say, the global majority that I did hear in the earlier months, and maybe the first year or two of the SMO. So yeah, I think this is something that he cares about. He's worked on, and he's worked on it successfully. And that could be at least one aspect of, what he's doing there in Anchorage. You say, okay, well, this may be a total flop, but again, I will further demonstrate to my friends around the world that I am, trying to find a diplomatic solution. I am not, I haven't, I'm looking for a solution other than, a purely military one. I'm not fixed on the military solution. That's, it's that simple. I think that, whatever happens, that he will have made that point to his friends around the world.
And you know what? If you think about the timing, at a time when the U.S. threatens to go after his allies, right? Oh, you're buying oil from him, so from them, so we're going to punish you, right? There's never been a more important time than now to cement his relationships with these allies, because he needs them, and they're going to be pressured more than ever. And maybe they're afraid that, maybe they're concerned that their population, if they feel some economic pain, could push on their government. Well, we're going to have to drop the Russians. So he's got to create political cover for his allies, so they can say to their people, hey, we're standing, look, this benefits us. Oh, the U.S. isn't going to push us around. And hey, look, the Russians did everything they can. They're our allies. They did everything they can. He gets, so I see a lot of wins. He gets to actually put his case. And let's not forget, he's a lawyer. And what does a lawyer want to do? A lawyer wants to state his case clearly in front of the judge, the jury, everybody. He wants to. Putin would probably want a lot of this to go public. They'll probably leak a lot of this. They'll probably release all kinds of things that they want released, and that they agree upon that can be released, and there'll be so they can go out there, and Putin can. The lawyer can say, "Here's my." We're not going to call it a closing argument. I think the Russians would view it as his opening argument. I can state my opening arguments to the jury, judge, jury, and advocate or whatever. And I can at the same time provide political cover for my allies, as my allies say, well, we looked at his argument and hey, yeah, that was pretty reasonable. The Western narrative of turning him as some evil demon who just wants to expand the Soviet Union. Well, you know what? My opening arguments will be there for all to review and say, hey, there are people in the West, such as me and you, who just say we're not for or against anything. We just want peace and justice. We can review those and make our independent analyses of these things based on what's said. For the next week, the alternative media is going to blow up. It's going to be like, okay, this is what was said. What does it mean? he gets to put that open argument out for all people like us to evaluate it, critics and non-critics. They get to say, okay, we're going to have another meeting in X amount of weeks. Let's set that meeting right up. So I just see so many wins. Now there are people, oh, they're going to go after Putin and try to take him out. I don't see the Russians as scared people. You know what I mean? I don't see them as frightened people. Oh, no, we're scared we're going to die. I see them as very brave people who are saying, look, we're the leaders of this country. And we tell our people, we're in a war. You got to go out on the line and you got to fight for your country. If they're going to risk their lives for our country as a leadership, we'll risk our lives for the country, too. That's the way I see this for people who say, oh, they might kill them. I don't think they will. It's on a military base. But I just don't think the Russian leadership is afraid to put their life on the line in the same way that they're asking the people that, they're brave fighters to put their life on the line. Anyway, I'll throw a lot of that, all of that stuff. That's
well, one thing. Yeah, I was just thinking about India in particular. I mean, I know before Trump slapped those tariffs on India, which, although 50%, whatever, but with all the carve outs, it's not nearly as bad as you might think, but still it's something significant. One thing, it hits the diamond industry very hard, which is actually connected to Modi's, I guess, hometown, his political base in India. So yeah, it's something that hurts the Indians. They didn't want it, but they stood firm. I knew the Chinese were, because they'd already been slapped with those tariffs, and they didn't blink, but neither did the Indians. And I'm sure that the Russians really appreciated what they did. And then they saw, well, interestingly too, just like prior to this, the Indians had been actually kind of lukewarm about BRICS. At certain aspects, they didn't want to, they didn't want it to be known as an anti-American, organization, and they were kind of a little bit annoyed with some of the statements coming from the other leaders. Even though they're careful, I think maybe the Indians were excessively concerned about American attitudes, hostility towards BRICS. But after this, I think it's just, they understood the importance of BRICS. And so you had a real shift. First they demonstrated that they were not going to be pushed about by the Americans. And I think probably this incident opened their eyes to American hostility. I think this is the process that we're seeing actually with all these countries. I think Iran really led the way, because they were the first ones to be targeted by the Americans in a really severe way. But then the Russians, and it's just like one country after another. At first, they don't really fully get it until they get hit by the Americans too. So now the Chinese are fully on board. Now the Indians are coming on board. But anyway, I was just thinking about the Indians in particular. I'm sure the Russians are grateful for what they've done. And if Modi is asked as a favor that, why don't you, go out of your way to see if you can find some sort of diplomatic solution? It'll help me here back in India, and it's something that I want. That's just another reason. Yeah, sure. Let's strengthen this relationship with India. It's growing stronger. Let's make it stronger still. Yeah, let's go off to Anchorage. And, who knows if Trump's going to understand anything I say, but my friend Modi in India, he'll appreciate it.
I think India is important right now. And a couple of things. I think the terrorist attack in Kashmir probably caused the Indians to raise an eyebrow and say, was the West maybe behind that? I'll put it like this. And I used to go on WION. I go on WION occasionally, Indian news. And I would say, you got Russia, Ukraine, you got China, Taiwan. India better think about Kashmir, because at some point the U.S. empire is going into Kashmir, and it's going to do a Ukraine-Taiwan move and say India's getting a little bit too big for its britches, and we got to take it down. And where's its weak spot? Taiwan, Ukraine, Kashmir, right? And maybe the Indians are waking up to the reality that as they aspire to be a world power, they got a lot of poverty in India, but they aspire to be a world power, and they got a lot of young people, and they have potential. As they aspire, the U.S. is going to come after them. They've got to go. They may be waking up to that. And I think so. You've got a combination of the tariffs, the Kashmir thing. You've got a number of things where now the U.S. is trying to say, India, you're just going to be another vassal and do what you're saying. I don't think, I also know some people who know India well saying, there are a lot of people in India that are furious. There are farmers starting to say we need to do some boycotting of the US. So I think that Trump's tariffs, et cetera, against India is providing political cover for the Modi government to shift, maybe become friendly with China, to do a little bit more to push back against Russia. I think the economic attack on India provides cover for the Indian government and incentive to move in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, I think it actually was very foolish, just looking at it in terms of raw American interests. It was because it was such an obvious slap in the face, such an obvious attack on their sovereignty. Now, let's say it's not, Trump is, in a way, you could say he's doing the same old thing. Actually, the Americans have long been intolerant of any kind of sovereignty in other countries, any country that doesn't really bow down. So it's not like Trump's the first guy to try to, bend arms and force another country, a sovereign nation, to submit to the American will. But Trump is just so blatant about it. He's so in your face, and he's the opposite of subtle. So by slapping these tariffs on India and, explicitly pointing to their relationship with Russia, their relationship with BRICS, doing something very similar in the case of Brazil, he has made American hegemony he has exposed it, to the peoples of these countries. In the past, it was something that was, like the people were in the know, knew that it was happening, but it was like the average person wasn't fully aware of it. And there was an effort to kind of keep it all behind the curtain, to do things back in the shadows, behind the scenes. But Trump, again, says the quiet part out loud. And that actually is, in a way, it's accelerating, again, the downfall, I think, of American hegemony. By being so obvious, he produces the kind of reaction that we see in India. There's real anger. There was, this is sort of a side, but like in a recent episode I did with my son Charlie, we did spend some time talking about India. And then Charlie said that he did a clip just of that India section, and it really took off among the Indians. You could see it with a lot of comments. So you could see there's that what he did really touched a nerve there. It was, again, very foolish. Even John Bolton, the Uber war hawk, John Bolton, said this was stupid. And here, for once, John Bolton was right. Because John Bolton, at least, understands with a power like India, you got to be a little bit more subtle.
Yeah, I agree. So I think, but for starters, I think I put it like this: is it a trap? Probably. Is it an off ramp in some ways for Trump? Probably. Is it geopolitical brilliance? Probably. It's like, just depends on how you want to spin it, how you want to look at it. I think that there is all of this, but here's where I differ from a lot of people. I don't think the Russian leadership is naive. I don't think they're stupid. I don't think they're over trusting. I believe that the Russian leadership knows what the hell they're up against, what they're dealing with, and the treachery that they're dealing with. And I just think they have made a decision that, okay, fine, this is who these people are. We're not going to make a Faustian deal, but we'll sit down on the other side of the table of the devil and hear what he has to say. We ain't going to pledge our soul to this guy when we walk away, because we know sooner or later how the Faustian deals end up. But if that's the devil on the other side of the table in this particular situation, you're okay. You're only screwed if you don't know who's on it. If you think there's an angel on the other side, you think he's a good guy and he's a bad guy, you're in a world of trouble. If you know who he is, and I believe the Russians know who it is, I think they're fine. And I don't believe that the U.S. is going to say, oh, we're going to execute Putin and kill all the Russians, and because that would be casus belli, probably lead to a rapid nuclear exchange. And what would be the point in that? I don't think they'll do it.
Yeah, I agree. They're not going to go that far. That's just too dangerous. They're crazy, but they're not that crazy. But yeah, about them being naive, I tend to agree with you. I guess you do hear critics, there are people, let's just put it this way. People that are, let's say, friends of the Russian government, or in general supporters of Putin, but they worry that maybe he's being taken in because they saw what happened, back with the Minsk agreements, and as you pointed out, Putin himself has admitted, okay, yeah, they took me for a ride, but I'm angry about it, and it was wrong. I made a mistake, and I think. I guess there's just this lingering fear that hasn't been erased among all kinds of supporters of the Russian government, both within Russia and outside of Russia, that, okay, he's going to be taken for a ride again because it happened once, and it could happen again. But I think you're right. If you look at the statements that Putin and Lavrov and others have been making, right up until just I think yesterday, they have been saying that our requirements have not changed. They've repeated it again and again and again. So I don't think we're seeing any indication that they are going to, sign on to a Minsk III. That's everybody's fear. I don't see it happening. I agree that, okay, Putin's made mistakes. He's admitted to mistakes, but he's a highly intelligent man that understands the world very well and clearly learns. His eyes have been opened to Western perfidy, and I don't think he's going to shut them to it now. I don't see it happening. So I think it's like all these other things that we've talked about. There are different possibilities. Maybe he can, just like working on a personal relationship with Trump. It can keep us away from Armageddon. Demonstrating a goodwill, a willingness to negotiate to Russia's partners around the world, perhaps providing the Americans with an off-ramp if, again, if Zelensky, foolishly rejects anything that might be agreed to here, that again can make it easier for the Americans to walk away. I don't know that they really can walk away from it, but it would at least increase that possibility. All those things are there. And, we'll see when it's all over exactly how it all falls out, but we may see a little bit of everything come out of this meeting.
The other thing I think is important is I forgot who was it said about the Europeans. If you're a Chihuahua and if you play a Doberman on TV long enough, you'll think you're a Doberman, but you're not. You're still a Chihuahua,
Right.
And one of the things that's interesting is watching these powerless people who have admitted, well, we don't have the money to fund this thing. We can't put together 25,000 troops amongst all of us. And not to mention our people won't let us do it. Our people will go bananas if we were to enter the war, which we can't. So we got nothing. So we're going to make demands and pretend like we got everything. They must do this. Trump must do this. Putin must do that. Everybody must. That if you just add the word must to your sentence, that there's somehow adding the word must gives you authority that you don't kinetically have in the physical world. Yes, the moon must go in a different direction. I don't like the direction it's going on. It must change directions. It must not rain tomorrow. That hurricane must go away. They use the word must as though it has some physical significance in the world that we live in. But to me, the further they stick their necks out, the more they make themselves look like fools, and the further they have to fall when this thing comes unglued. And I think that I think this is if I were Putin, I'd be thinking like this: 5 to 10 years. If we make this, all of those leaders, their governments are going to fall to pieces. There will be complete new leadership. And this is, if I'm the Russians, this is what I'm thinking. If I make it 5 to 10 years, there will be total new leadership in there. The countries, they'll be poor and impoverished anyway in Europe. And by the way, the people will be looking for there'll be Eurosceptics. The EU's falling apart. So if I could drag this thing out for 5 years, politically, I probably win. That's what I'm thinking if I'm the Russians. I could be right or wrong, but that's just what I'm thinking. Anyway, your thoughts on the yapping Chihuahuas who think they're Dobermans?
Yeah, no, it's quite an extraordinary phenomenon. You're right. You don't know really what's going on in their heads, but I think they're having trouble coming to terms with the new reality, the new world that they lived in. They're still, I think it was like the 1990s just kind of warped the minds of a lot of people. It was like some sort of drug high that the Western world experienced. And it's something that they just can't let go of. We are the world's hegemon. Russia is a basket case, and, that is the reality. And so if Russia is not, Russia must, like you use the word must again. Yeah, Russia must fall. Russia must listen to us. If we're not seeing the results that we want to see right away, it's because we ourselves haven't pushed hard enough, because that is the way things are. Russia is weak. And I think it was like the Polish president, it wasn't too long ago, several months ago, that he actually just said that, that Russia is weak and is bound to fall. And I think maybe that this is something that they started out this war believing. They really did. I think they thought that this would come to an end quickly, that they would achieve a regime change in Russia, soon. The Russian economy would collapse. The Ukrainian army would be marching into Crimea and maybe onto Moscow. They were quite confident. I think they really were. And it didn't work. And well, you can do two things when something like that happens. You can stop and say, well, wait a second, maybe my assumptions were incorrect. Let's reassess this. Okay, maybe I read the situation wrong. Let's take a new approach. Or you can double down and you can try to recapture that high that you had in the 90s. He says, this is, and that seems to be all where they are. It's just like, okay, this isn't working out the way it's supposed to. But it's just that we have to wait for one more month, one more sanctions package. We just have to do more of the same, and we have to be even more united, and we have to shut up those dissidents, those like Fico in Slovakia, or whoever it is, or dissidents, both dissident countries and dissidents within the nations. We just have to speak, with a unified voice, and then the Russians will fall. It seems to be the course that they're on. So the thing that I worry about is that, it looks like they're all becoming unpopular. If you look at the polls, I think maybe like Merz is doing better than some of the others, but he's only at 29%, and he's been chancellor just for a few months. This is really pathetic. That typically you get some sort of honeymoon, but he just dropped like a rock from the start. Everybody hates him in Germany.
And the AfD is now polling at number one.
Right. And so that's what you're seeing in all these countries. I think like the National Rally in France is way ahead of Macron's party. It's all of these governments are collapsing. So you would think, we hope, and this is what I think we have good reason to hope. The Russians have good reason to hope that there will be there will be some kind of, maybe not a revolution, but a real change of the guard in Europe and a new reorientation. At least in some of these countries, you see that possibility. But on the other hand, you see like Macron, he's popular. He's a very unpopular man in France, but he just will not leave. He always finds ways to stay on top. And you see similar things in Germany and in the UK. There are these games that they play. And then in other countries like Romania, Moldova, there's just this increasingly obvious authoritarianism of the sort that we see in Ukraine, just banning of opposition parties and opposition candidates and whatever. And that may be the course that they go on. They can't let go of this delusion that they have. Are they going to just kind of step down and no, for them, this is what Europe is. This is something that we can't abandon. This is the rules-based international order. That we can't let it go. It's the end of the world, at least of our world, if we let it go. And so, well, maybe to save democracy, we've got to clamp down on democracy for a while. There's a chance that we're going to see that, just a kind of increasing authoritarian bent, by these very, very unpopular governments.
Well, one of the things we're even seeing here, we see that during the Russiagate, that they were making statements. One of the things that I was reading recently said that they were saying, after Trump won, they were saying this is a crisis for democracy. but he won. Not that I believe this is a democracy anyway, but he won. But it just simply tells you this. When they say democracy, when I say democracy, what do I mean? Right? I mean rule bottom-up politics. The people elect people who represent them and represent the needs of the masses. Well, that's not what we have. They represent the ruling elite. Okay. When they say democracy, what they mean is democracy for the ruling elite. The ruling elite get together, they fight it out, they choose us, we represent them. Okay. So when they said it was a crisis for democracy, based on my definition of a crisis for democracy, I'd argue it's a crisis when you get Clinton and Trump and Biden and Harris and these kind of people winning. Who are your options? How do you call that democracy? But their perspective was it's a crisis for the ruling elite and the rule of the elite, because they didn't necessarily choose this guy and he won't go along with everything they want exactly as they wanted. So he'll go with 95%, but 5% he'll aggravate him and he'll say things he shouldn't say. So to them, it's a crisis for democracy. And in Europe, the crisis for democracy is the ruling elite don't get to choose everybody and everything and tell everybody what to do. And so therefore you got Moldova, you got arresting people, you got Romania arresting people, you got France arresting people, you got, AFD might have to be barred. You see all the things that we call anti-democratic, and they say, no, we're doing that to maintain the ruling elite's power and total and complete power, which is how we interpret democracy.
Yeah, no, I think that's clearly what it is. They have identified themselves with democracy. No, I am democracy. We are democracy. And so if you want to vote us out, you're clearly trying to get rid of democracy. So we just simply have to clamp down, shut you up, so that democracy can continue to reign. And it seems like, there are different things, like there are issues that they can compromise on and issues that they won't. And among the issues that they won't compromise on are the geopolitics. It's the hostility to Russia, right? It's like Viktor Orban, if he goes off, he's one reason that he's targeted. He may not be there too long. They're going after him. I think they're going to use every dirty trick in the book to get rid of him. And
well, look what they did to Fico. They shot him 5 times.
Yeah,
they ain't above using those kinds of machinations.
Yeah, clearly. So Fico. It's just like, and it's the parties that actually talk about repairing relationships with Russia. If that's one of the things they can put up with, a lot of things: higher taxes, lower taxes. Environmental regulations can be strengthened, or all these different things that should be issues in campaigns. There's a certain amount of tolerance that they can show on these issues. But when it comes to geopolitics, no, the hostility to Russia must be maintained. It's not like Viktor Orban is not pro-Russian, but he's saying, hey, we need to talk with them. We need to trade with them. It's just part of being, we have to deal with this reality, and that's something they cannot accept. So it's not just that, okay, they don't tolerate pro-Russian positions, but they don't tolerate just any kind of, calm attitude, realistic attitude towards Russia. You have to be hostile all the time. You have to join us, this pack of yapping little dogs. And if you stop yapping, you look over and this has one little dog, we're going to have to get rid of him. He doesn't belong to the pack anymore, because we all need to keep on yapping at that bear over there. And, it's ridiculous, but it seems to be true. That's today's Europe.
And to me, the demonstration that it's not ideological is this: Fico is a new school free market conservative, right? Orban. Fico is an old USSR supporting red. You know what I mean? He's a communist socialist kind of guy, old school. But both of them believe in some level of independence and sovereignty. And that's what the empire really hates. Both of them say, but my country should make a decision as to our foreign policy and our internal policy. And that's the problem that they have with Russia. That's the problem the empire has with China and Iran and all of these countries, and India. India's running, and Brazil is running. Everybody's running up against that thing where the country says, yeah, well, when it comes to who we buy from and what we buy and what we do, we're going to make those decisions. No, you're not. You're just simply not going to do it. In the U.S., that's the thing with India. You look at it and you say, well, that's so stupid. Why would you ostracize India and push them to China? Why? Because they're trying to exercise sovereignty and independence. They're saying, look, our energy policy, we got to do what's best for us. No, you're not allowed. You will do what's best for us. You will do what you're told. And we're tolerating nothing else. And that's where the empire now is so challenged on so many fronts and weakened that they're getting over the top in their demands for fealty.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, what makes it absolutely necessary to say to Brazil and India, you got to do what you're told, because they can't tolerate it anywhere, because it's starting to grow. And they're like, oh no, this thing, it's metastasizing everywhere. People want to do, no, you can't, you neither. And they're getting crazy with it.
Yeah, no, it seems like it's starting to unravel so that, it's, I think it's a sign of panic, a certain level. They wouldn't ever admit it, but some kind of desperation. I mean, Trump, I think, rightly understands that U.S. hegemony rests on the dollar, and it's just the fact that other countries are choosing not to use the dollar. I mean, it doesn't have to be hostile, but they're sovereign countries. They have their own currencies. The other country has its own currency. Hey, let's trade in our respective currencies. But that's intolerable. I mean, Trump has just said it outright. And, that's why he's going after BRICS, and he's threatened tariffs on all, BRICS members. He considers them to be an anti-American organization, just because they're willing to exercise their sovereignty. That's right. And, I think on some level, they see the writing on the wall. One thing is like when you're in a hegemon who is very secure in his position. Okay, I rule the world. I see no rivals, anywhere to the horizon. I reign over the entire globe. The globe is mine. That was the U.S. in the 1990s, and that led to a lot of foolish decisions, which kind of brought us to where we are now. But there was a certain confidence, and it could allow for, at least at a rhetorical level, a certain kind of magnanimity. Just say that, we can. There wasn't a need for this really heavy-handed treatment of other powers. But as it's changing, and these countries are switching from the dollar, for example, that has sparked a certain amount of fear within the U.S. And then we begin to see kind of this flailing about this. Maybe Trump is just symptomatic that it's his personality. But who knows if it was a different president? Even Kamala Harris, we may have been seeing a lot of the same policies, because there is this. This is what they all agree upon, whether it's Trump, or Kamala Harris, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, whether it's Macron or Merz, is that the U.S. needs to rule the world. That's the way it should be. And, that's what's holding the world together in their minds. And if in their imaginations, if the hegemon falls, there will be chaos and darkness will envelop the world. Again, there's that metaphor of the jungle or whatever, which we've heard from the neocons, and it's been picked up by the Europeans. Trump is, seems to be he kind of embodies this new, I think, fearful hegemon, better than his own personality, his heavy-handed treatment of them. But I think that this is where we're headed in a way anyway, because the fact is that the empire is falling, and whoever is president of the U.S. is going to be committed to maintaining this empire, and it's going to do what it takes, to maintain it. And the soft words or whatever clearly aren't enough anymore. So yeah, we're becoming open about our hegemony. No.
Yeah, you know what? Trump's bombastic outward appearance to cover, which is obviously to cover a level of insecurity, a high level of insecurity, is exactly the exact metaphor for the U.S. empire. Last thing I'll ask you before we go, interesting. I saw something the other day, and I don't know if it was overall Democrats or if it was people under 40, but it was 92% of Democrats are opposed to what Israel's doing. And for all we look at Trump doing all kind of crazy stuff, Democratic Party is, I don't know how the hell. One thing, they're not like, yay, we can't wait for the midterms. I think they're petrified at this point of what could happen in the midterms, in that a lot of their people could be challenged by young anti-Zionist people. And if they are challenged by they're looking at Mamdani. Which,
yeah,
I got my issues with the DSA people. I'll say this, they seem to be oftentimes like a light version of the Democratic Party. But that being said, I think they're looking at Mamdani and they're thinking, oh my God, what could the Democratic Party look like if all of our dinosaurs get wiped out in the primaries and we just get a bunch of these types of people who aren't pro-Israel? We could be in deep and serious trouble, and they better be scared.
Yeah. Well, again, they're right. The ground shifting beneath their feet. The polls are showing, that they're losing their own people, especially on the issue of Israel. But at the same time, they remain highly dependent on Zionist money. The mega donors are, without exceptionist supporters of Zionism. And that's the way business has been done, right, in both political parties for such a long time. It's just like, we have our comfortable arrangements. We have our mega donors. We know how elections are won. And I don't think let's say the old guard, the Democratic political establishment is really ready to come to terms with this new reality. So it's going to be interesting. That's right. They may have an unwanted revolution on their hands here, and I look forward to. I hope that a lot of the old guard, the Zionist old guard, is overthrown. That could, and that the Democratic establishment is thrown into a panic. It will be fun to watch.
Yeah. Fun's one word. The other word, is total collapse. Let me find one thing I want to show everybody before we go. Okay. All right, everyone, here we go. Before we go, I just want everybody to see this. This is a great podcast. It's called Conversations Among the Ruins. And this is Peter and his son, Charlie. This is their YouTube page. And we can see, what are they up to? Wow, 38,000. When I started watching you guys, when I first started watching you, I think you were at 11,000. And now you're at 38,000. So there's a reason they're growing. They're growing because, hey, man, it's a great channel. They cover everything. They do really good stuff. So you might want to go, you do want to go to Conversations Among the Ruins, and you want to subscribe and keep up with their stuff. As you can see, when Peter and I hang out, really great analysis, competent analysis. And, it's Peter is reserved in he's not over the top and said, oh, this is going to happen. That's not going to happen. He's very reserved and he's it's competent analysis. I enjoy it. So Conversations Among the Ruins, make sure you go there and become a subscriber. Thanks a lot, everybody. Going to be an interesting, I'm interested to see what you guys are going to have to say Monday morning. I'm probably going to do some stuff over the weekend, when things start leaking out, but I suspect we'll get, I don't know, it could be one of two ways. We could get like little teeny leaks here and there, or the other side of it is both parties could say, we want all this stuff out, and just bam, as quickly as possible. I suspect the Russians are going to be releasing stuff that they want to get out quickly. So it could be an exciting weekend. But I'm looking forward to it. Thanks a lot, Peter, and look forward to having you again next week. I've been, the summer's been a little tough for all of us. I've been traveling and, going to the beach last week and different things like that. So but I think we're all getting back on our regular schedule.
Yeah.
Well, what am I talking about? You're in Sochi, for God's sake.
Right. Yeah, I'll be back in the U.S. a week from now.
Okay, sounds good. All right, everybody.
Okay.
Hey, here's what's important. If you can, whether it's Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, it's highly appreciated if you could support the channel. Make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. You'll also notice I have a P.O. box if you want to send stuff there. If you want to mail it, I actually have a snail mail P.O. box. It's right at the bottom, scrolling across there. The most important thing you can do is share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you very much. We're out.